When the Wright brothers were growing up in Dayton, Ohio, they used to go sledding every winter. And they noticed that the sleds on the hill, some would go fast and some would go slow. They wanted to have the fastest sled on the hill. So they went home and they asked their mother. They said, "Can you help us build the fastest sled on that hill?" And she said, "Yeah, I'll help you." And the boys started walking towards the garage at their house where they would build the sled. And their mother said, "No, don't go to the garage. Before we can build the sled, we first have to design it." And she said, "The place to design it is here on the kitchen table." And so those young boys learned from their mother the process of design. And she asked them questions. She said, "What would make a sled go faster if it had long runners or short runners?" And she engaged them in a dialogue of question and answer, which helped them realize that they needed long runners with the least amount of friction to have the fastest sled on the hill. So with the help of their mother, Orville and Wilbur Wright designed and built the fastest sled on the hill. And they flew down that hill. And that was when they were probably 10 or 12 years old. Fast forward a few years to 1892. Orville and Wilbur Wright have both graduated high school. Neither of them have gone to college, and they need to choose some kind of career for themselves. The automobile had been invented already, but it was a plaything for the rich. It was still 16 more years before the Model T was going to be invented by Ford in 1908. So this is back in 1892. The big deal back then was bicycles. Everybody loved to have a bicycle. It was fairly inexpensive. It was a form of transportation and a form of recreation. So the Wright brothers opened up a bicycle store in Dayton, Ohio. And the store was successful. But Wilbur Wright, the older of the two brothers, he felt a bit restless. And by about 1895, he started looking around for a life challenge, something that would engage his intellect beyond the bicycle store. And he read in some magazine articles that there were people in other countries and in the United States that were beginning to experiment with building a flying machine, an airplane. They didn't have a word for it back then, so they called it a flying machine. And he read of a German experimenter named Otto Liebenthal and his attempts to build gliders. He had some successful attempts to build gliders where it was a human-powered, he would fly in the glider itself down the hill, almost like a hang glider. And sadly, this German fellow, he died in a glider accident. I think it was about 1898. But he inspired many to try and continue his work. And so Wilbur Wright read everything he could possibly read, and he developed some ideas about the process of how an airplane ought to be invented. His ideas were, you first have to have a very light vehicle, that you go in small steps, and that you make sure that that vehicle, that glider, can fly under human control. And that the last step would be to add an engine, a motor. Other people were taking a big motor and they were putting wings on it and trying to fly. And Wilbur Wright felt the way to go is to design the glider first and put on the motor as the very last step. And so he wrote a letter, a very famous letter, to the Smithsonian Institution. And the Smithsonian at that time was sort of like a big public library. It was a museum already. It was the place where people who were innovating would share information about what the projects they were up to. And in that famous letter that Wilbur Wright wrote to the Smithsonian, he said, "I am infected with the belief that flight is possible to man." That letter was answered by the Smithsonian, and one of the people that Wilbur Wright ended up being in touch with was an aviation pioneer from France, but living in Chicago, and his name was Octave Chanute. Wilbur Wright started a correspondence with Octave Chanute. Chanute was an elderly gentleman, and I think in his 70s. And he knew that he did not have the energy or the skill to design the flying machine that was so exciting part of that time. But he knew that he had all the skills to help those persons who did design that flying machine. He had all the background. And so he offered some encouragement to Wilbur Wright, and Wilbur found this encouragement very beneficial, because he felt that his approach, his process, was the one that was going to lead to success. Then Wilbur Wright, as he continued on his project to build a flying machine, he decided that he needed to find a location where the winds were steady, so that he could do multiple tests to measure the wings and to measure this and measure that. He needed steady wind. He wrote several letters to the United States Weather Service, and they responded that there were 3 places that sounded like they could serve his needs. One was in San Diego in California, another location was in Florida, and the third was in North Carolina on the Outer Banks. And in particular, there was a location named Kitty Hawk, a small fishing village. San Diego, California was attractive, except for the fact there wasn't any large sand dunes. And same for Florida. The size of the sand dunes or the quantity of sand dunes were not sufficient for Wilbur Wright, and so he decided to take his experiments to North Carolina. So after deciding that North Carolina was the location for his aeronautical tests, Wilbur Wright packed up the glider that he had designed, and he had not yet enlisted the support of his brother. They were very close, but this was Wilbur's project at that time. This was 1899 or so. Then about 1900, when he was out there in North Carolina, he built a shed and where he could live, and I think there was a second shed where the glider could live. And he spent a lot of time observing birds, especially the buzzards that would stay up in the air on these wind currents, and they would just float on the currents without even moving forward or backwards. And Wilbur Wright did lots of little tests with his glider going down the sand dunes. Now the glider was made of wood, and the wood that he chose was called spruce. Pine wood was more plentiful and less expensive, but spruce was the wood that had the durability that he needed. So the wings were made out of wood, and the plane or the glider was held together with wire and twine. It was very strong, like a thin rope covered in wax. The wings themselves were covered with a fabric, a sateen, S-A-T-E-E-N. It's like a linen. Imagine maybe like a bed sheet. And that the fabric was what lifted the plane or lifted the glider up, the air traveling over that fabric. So that fabric was an important part of the glider. They also sometimes called the glider a kite. And Wilbur Wright himself sewed the fabric tightly onto the frame, onto the wooden frame. Who taught him how to sew? His mother. His mother had taught him how to sew. She was a very practical-minded person, and he knew how to sew. And the sewing that he did was very strong sewing patterns. And he decided he needed the help of his younger brother, Orville, and he invited him to come out and participate in the tests of the glider at Kitty Hawk.